Helene and I were watching a film on TV the other day, and in the one scene on the TV, there was two men standing talking, and they were on the edge of a playground, and they were looking into the playground, and the one guy who was in the movie, he had just found out that his wife was pregnant with twins, his first kids, and he was beside himself with fear and nervousness. And he's standing next to another guy who's looking into the play area, and he says to this guy, "Hey, are any of these kids yours?" And the guy says, "Yep, I've got three of them, that one, and that one." And this guy who's got no kids, but he's got two coming on the way, he says to him, "Tell me, what is parenting like? I've never been a parent. What is it like?" And the guy looked at him like this. He said, "It's terrible. It's terrible. It's terrible. But then you have a moment. It's terrible, and then it's terrible, and then you have a moment." It goes from all these terrible, terrible, terrible things of dirty nappies and sleepless nights and everything, and you think, this is so terrible, I'm never going to be the same ever again, and anybody who's ever a parent will be able to identify this. But then you have that moment when that kid opens his eyes in the morning and he smiles, and you think, the terrible is forgotten, because in the moment, I just feel so overwhelmed with love for this little character. Have you got to identify with that? Terrible, terrible, terrible. And then, man, you have that moment that makes all the terrible fade into insignificance. Now, I thought about that in the context of the story of the cross, because the story of the cross is an interesting one, and the message of Easter is as relevant as anything that you could find today. The message of Easter, and particularly the resurrection, addresses all the fears of mankind. In one foul swoop, we address every fear that exists out there. The message of Easter is deeply relevant. But the story of Easter is a great story. It's kind of like a build-up to a perfect storm. You know, in the perfect storm, which is a story, and it says, you have the story of the perfect storm where there's a bad guy, there's a villain, there's a whole bunch of obnoxious people, there's a really good guy, and then there's an incredible plot, and it builds up to an incredible perfect storm. I think the story of Easter is the greatest perfect storm story that was ever been lived out. It's not even made up. It's the truth of this perfect storm. And then I look at you, and I see many people in this room who are living in a storm right now. Some of them are perfect storms where there's a plot and there's a villain in the story, and there's sadness and there's tragedy that has been knocking on your door, and you feel, man, I'm in the story of a perfect storm, and I need to listen well today to the story of Jesus' perfect storm. Now, if anybody who's been a sailor or been out to sea knows this, they know that when you get out to sea and you get into a storm, your one and only real prerequisite, a compass is of no use to you at that time. The only thing you really need is you need a good anchor, because you've got to anchor yourself to something when the storms and the billows are raging and the waves are crashing around you, and the wind is blowing through the sails, and there's waves all around the place. You've got to have a good anchor. And when you have an anchor, it gives you that security to know, I can weather this storm. If you don't have an anchor, the problem is that you're going to be blown all over the place. You're going to end up on the rocks. You've got to have a good anchor. But the only problem with the anchor is it's under the waterline. And so when you're looking at the boat, you think, is something under the waterline going to really help me? I can't see it. I don't know it's there, but I know the evidence that it's there because I'm stable and I'm able to weather the storm. The anchor is an absolute prerequisite if you're going through a storm of life. And so if the perfect storm is brewing around you today, don't try and fix the perfect storm. Make sure you have a really good anchor. An anchor that you can trust, an anchor that you can hold on to, an anchor that is firm. Now for us, we look at Jesus and we say, I won't find a firmer anchor than that. But let's take that a little bit further. We think that Jesus' teachings are going to be our anchor. Nope, they're good teachings. We think that Jesus' miracles are going to be our anchor. Nope, that's not true either. They were great, they were spectacular, and they showed his power, they showed his godship, and yet that's not our anchor. We go to the cross, and we say, anchor at the cross, and I'm thinking, that should surely be a good anchor. but it's not as good as the anchor of the resurrection of Jesus. Everything meaningful and powerful revolves around the resurrection of Christ. That is our great anchor. So if you're going through some storms today, listen carefully to what I have to say. You've got to learn what it means to trust your anchor. You say, well, give me an example. Let me tell you this. I look at the disciples. And after Jesus had died and risen, great persecution came across the church. People were being tortured. They were being crucified. They were being thrown to lions. Those who named themselves as followers of Jesus underwent an incredible persecution, of which the disciples, all except one, died a martyr's death. And I'm looking at those 12 guys and 11 that died a martyr's death, and the other one, they tried to kill him, but they just couldn't get it done, so they exiled him. But I look at them and I said, well, what made them go through that? How is it that they could weather those incredible storms in themselves? It was terrible, terrible, terrible. But then they had a moment. They had a moment where they remembered the resurrection of Jesus. Man, we've got to get better memories, people. If we could really remember what Jesus has done through the cross and ultimately his resurrection, oh my word, what different people we would be. So this resurrection of trusting your anchor, these guys who went into martyrdom, for them, their life was, they were faithful to God because they remembered the resurrection, and that they would have a resurrection one day as well. Now for us, the implications and also the applications are hugely life-changing. Do you remember that song? Those of you who come from my generation will surely remember it. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Do you remember that song, many of you? It was a Gaither song back in the 1970s or even earlier. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Now, I asked Lizzie if we could sing that song. We will probably sing it later on. But I said, Lizzie, do you mind leaving out the second verse? Because the second verse just sounds so corny. So corny. Let me tell you what the second verse says. How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives. Now, I can identify with that right now. Truly, I can. But I'm thinking, what has that got to do with because he lives, I can face tomorrow? And so I was talking to the team the other day, our pastoral team, and I told them what I wanted to do on Sunday. And I said, I want to sing that song, Lizzie, but I don't want the second verse. It's just too nebulous. It's just too corny. And then Errol very appropriately pointed out to me to say, no, that's the greatest verse in the whole song. And I'm saying, what? Singing about a newborn baby, how much joy it brings to us? He said, yes, you've got to understand the context of that song. Bill and Gloria Gaither wrote that song during the Vietnam War in those days. And there was demonstration, there was pain, there was suffering, there were anger all over America. And they wrote this song in the context of that environment where people were hopeless and saying, what hope is there for our kids? What hope is there for our children in this world that is so messed up? Is there any hope that my kids are going to be able to survive this messed up world? And now I realize the power of that song. Let me finish that verse. How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives. But greater still, the calm assurance, this child, your child, you can face uncertain days because he lives. You've got to get that. That you can face uncertain days, not because you're big and strong and you've got money in the bank. No. You can face uncertain days simply because he lives. That's the power of the resurrection as it should be seen in our lives. Let me give you a couple of examples. First of all, I want to entitle the sermon, Because He Lives. Now, there are many different applications, and I just want to read the story too. Because he lives, there's a whole lot of things we can hold on to. Mark chapter 16. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, her world had fallen apart, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, obviously they were surprised. They saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. So too would we have been. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here." And the moment for the Marys and Salome was just incredible. It had been terrible, terrible, terrible. And then all of a sudden, man, there was this moment when everything was put into perspective, everything, all the pain and the suffering and the death, because Jesus had risen from the dead. I hope you get the moment that I'm talking about today. You ever look at Mary, and this was bad news what had happened to her son, Jesus, but by the time they'd finished, it was okay with her because it was okay with Jesus. You see, if it's okay with Jesus, it doesn't matter how bad it gets with you. And it will always be okay with Jesus. No matter the magnitude of the storms, no matter how fast the wind blows and how big the waves get, it will always be okay with you. You know why? Because it's already okay with Jesus. Have a look at that man that walked to Emmaus and they run away devastated and disappointed. And some of you are sitting in that category today, where you're in church today and you think, man, I'm disappointed with God. I'm disappointed with the church. And if you're honest, there are many of us who sometimes feel a little bit like that. And you're on your way to Emmaus because you're grumpy and you didn't get your own way and things didn't go exactly as you wanted them to do. And then suddenly you meet Jesus. It was terrible, 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 but now you have that moment as they sat with Jesus and they ate the supper together and the scales fell off their eyes and suddenly realized, hey man, this is Jesus. He was the one who died. Now he's alive. He's well. And in that moment, everything that was terrible that had happened didn't matter anymore because Jesus was okay. And so I say to you today, because he lives, you can face tomorrow. That's true. And you're sitting there saying, oh, Trevor, what if? What about if I lose my job, Trevor? What about if I get cancer, Trevor? What about if I lose my family or somebody gets killed or something like that? What if those things happen? Well, let me tell you, it doesn't matter what if you have thrown at you. What if they're thrown at you, you'll be able to face it, simply because it's okay with Jesus right now. And because it's okay with him, that moment you understand that truth is the moment that everything becomes okay. You say, is it that simple? Apparently so. So many truths that we see in examples of people who find this to be the truth. The second truth I want to say is because he lives, I can make peace with my past. I don't know about you, but I'm glad you don't know my whole past, because there's stuff that I would not want for you to see or know. But that's okay. You don't have to know it. I know it full well. And so it's taken some time, and still is an ongoing journey to make peace with your own past. But there's a formula for peace. Psalm 85 verse 10 gives it to us, where it says that justice and peace have kissed one another. God's desire for justice, God's righteousness, has been appeased because of the kiss he has with peace. It is love that leads us to peace. So it's really justice plus the kiss with the love of God gives us a situation of peace. That's what the psalm says. So God, who's a just God, he's a holy God, he cannot look upon sin. But because he loves us, he can't help it. He is love. He doesn't have to do or wake up to do loving things. He is love. No matter what you do, no matter what you become, God will always be love. And because he is love, it meets, and I love the terminology, justice and his love have kissed together, which gives to us peace. Think of that thief on the cross that Jesus died with a couple of days before the resurrection. And here was a man who hung there with his other sidekick who cursed Jesus, didn't want to know anything about him. And this man cried out to Jesus and said, Jesus, are you really who you say you are? And Jesus said, yep, read the side above my head. I'm the King of the Jews. And the man said, I'm battling, Jesus, but is it possible that I could come to your kingdom? And Jesus says to him, yep, it'll be fine. Today you'll be with me in my kingdom, because he acknowledged that the other thief, he said to the other thief, you and I get what we deserve. We both deserve to die this miserable death. He has done nothing, pointing to Jesus. And that's a beautiful situation of somebody who's repentant and somebody saying, please forgive me. I'm a mess. But Jesus, you're okay. And it's terrible, terrible, terrible with me. But if you're okay, then can I be okay as well and come to your kingdom? And Jesus said, yep, today you will be with me in paradise. So this peace of God is the peace with God, first of all. But then there's something that grows out of peace with God, and that's the peace of God. Now, I don't know who I'm talking to today, but I'm pretty sure there must be some people running around here that are feeling rather upset about stuff, upset about the country and the electricity and the water and all those other things, and probably a whole lot of other things as well. And somebody has stolen your peace, because peace is a commodity that can easily be stolen or lost or misplaced. But here we find that Jesus doesn't just give us peace with God. He offers to you today, through the resurrection, the peace of God. And this is the peace of God that passes all understanding. And the reason it passes all understanding is because it doesn't come from your circumstances. It comes from Him. He's the one who gives a peace that you'll never understand, a peace you'll never fully comprehend, and you can't explain, because it comes from Him. John chapter 4, we have a beautiful account of a woman who came traumatized and messed up. And she had a terrible past. She'd been rejected by everybody. The community didn't want to know her. She'd had 5 husbands, and she was in a bad way. And she goes to the well, finds Jesus at the well. And Jesus says, lady, can you give me some water to drink? And this woman says, would you ask of me? You're a Jew. I'm not a Jew. Why would you ask of me? And Jesus said, if you knew who was talking to me, who'd talking to you, you'd know to ask me to give you living water. And so this great conversation takes place between this woman and Jesus over the issue of water. Let me stop there for a moment. I just want to sneak this in here. It's beautiful. We've got Chris and Sherry here from the United States at the moment, and they run a beautiful ministry called the Bucket Ministry, where their passion is to give people clean water to drink. And so with Genesis, they're partnering with us at the moment to start this great project. And their endeavor is to give clean water to people so they don't sick and die of terrible waterborne disease. And so they've come up with a beautiful project, and we're beginning to get involved with them, and it's just a wonderful. Their passion is for clean water. Jesus' passion is not just for clean water, but it's for living water. Jesus, clean water is great, and He's right behind that. He wants people to drink clean water. But His concern is more for living water than anything else. And we see how He offers this woman living water and how she receives it. And as she came right with Christ, because her life had been terrible, 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 and then she had that moment where she saw Jesus for who He was, she received the living water from Him, and she ran back to her community to tell them what had happened. Have you noticed something in the story? She left her pot behind. She didn't say, oh, Jesus, that's all really lovely what you've done for me, and I'm that glad I've got living water. I've just got to draw some water with my pot here quickly and go home. She was so excited. She left her pot and she ran back to the village. She left that burdensome, heavy, miserable pot at the well with Jesus. You see, if you want living water, you've got to leave the old one behind. And too many of you are carrying too much baggage. You're still carrying the pot. Oh, you want the living water, but the old pot is weighing you down, man. And it's full of baggage and it's full of weight, and you keep spilling it, and it's a miserable thing. For goodness sake, people, leave the pot behind. Because that's what Jesus says, the peace of God that passes all understanding. He says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I'll refresh you with living water. But by the way, leave the old pots behind. I love that little aspect of this woman's story. So because he lives, I can make peace with my past. One more thing. Because he lives, I have power in the present. I have power in the present because of his presence. You know, it's beautiful. I was just checking it out yesterday, that there was a couple of times when the disciples found themselves in their own storm on the sea. They didn't have an anchor. They had Jesus. But here's how the two stories went. The one story was when they were out at sea and they saw this apparition that looked like a ghost, they said. And then Peter looked and said, no, that apparition is not a ghost. That apparition is Jesus. He cries out to this apparition to say, Jesus, is that you? If it is you, Jesus, tell me to come and walk to you on the water. Peter gets out and walks on the water, and he realized that the apparition that looked like a ghost was in fact Jesus. Some of you in your lives have got miserable storms, and there's an apparition that you think might just be Jesus, but you haven't trusted it yet. And as he stepped out on the water, he said, Jesus, I'm leaving all these other cronies behind. They're not going to come with me. But Jesus, I'm going to step out on the boat and I'm going to trust you because I know you're not a ghost. To them, you're just a ghost. You promised something that could be good. But Jesus, I'm taking that step of faith because I believe you are with me even in the midst of the storm. And then we see the other account of the other storm that they were in, where they went out on the boat and Jesus fell asleep in the middle of the storm. And the waves are pounding, and they're battling to keep the thing up, and they look up and say, where's Jesus? Why isn't he helping us? He needs to row a bit. He needs to help us. And they look, and there's Jesus fast asleep in the stern of the boat. They wake him up, and they say, Jesus, don't you care, man? Look at the storm around us. Don't you think you should maybe help us? And Jesus rebukes them and says, oh, you of little faith. And with one word, he calms the storm. Have you got a sleeping Jesus in your boat, in the midst of your storm? Let me break the news to you. He does care. He may just be asleep for a little while, but there will come a time when you can even know a sleeping Jesus is more powerful than no Jesus at all. And when Jesus is asleep, you can smile in the midst of the storm and say, it's okay. It's terrible out there, but I know when he wakes, there's going to be a great moment when he wakes up. So this presence of Jesus in the midst of the storm is what really makes life work, gives you the power to live out your Christian experience. Too many of us are running on empty right now, and it's terrible. It's really terrible. But there will come that moment when Pentecost will come into our lives, as Pentecost did in those days. And as the disciples who were so weak and frail and fragile before they received the gift of the Holy Spirit, but on Pentecost, oh my word, the Jesus that was once with them is now not just with them, he is in them. And the power of God in you is the power of God to be worked out through you. You're trying to live the Christian experience in your own power, you're dead in the water. You're never going to cut it. You'll be exhausted by midday and grumpy by the evening. You'll never do it. But the power of Christ in you is your hope of glory, because that's the power of God in you. And so because he lives, I can have power in the present, because of the acknowledged presence of God. You see, it's easy just to kind of say, oh yeah, we know that Jesus is with us. We pray those prayers. Lord, bless me and be with me today. And we believe that he is. But until you really acknowledge it and start living according to that which you say you believe, it's going to mean zip. It's going to mean nothing at all. But when you say, Jesus, I know you're going to be with me today. I'm going to live by faith today. I'm going to share my faith with people today. Jesus, your power in me is something I'm going to ponder every moment of the day. And I'm going to live like I have the power of God. And Jesus said, hallelujah. It's about time that took place. Because that's the powerful moment in your own personal existence. He is there, but he's just asleep until you wake him and he activates all that he has within you. Make sense? I have one last thought. Just one last. Concluding. Just now, you're gonna sing a song. It says this. Then came the morning. This is one of the verses that sealed the promise. Your buried body began to breathe. Out of the silence, the roaring lion declared the grave has no claim on me. Jesus, yours is the victory. I think we've already sung that song. The roaring lion is coming out of the grave, and he's declaring some home truths to you today. The roaring lion. When he went into the grave, he was a slain lamb, the Lamb of God that was slain for the sins of mankind, the sin of the world. And now all of a sudden, can you imagine Satan standing at the tomb, and he's looking at the rock in front of the tomb, and he's rubbing his hands and said, hey guys, to all these demons, we did it. We've put him dead, buried, and he's behind the rock in the tomb. We win. Satan happened to be walking past the tomb 3 days later when all of a sudden he gets a bit of a fright. The stone has been removed. He runs up to the tomb. He says, what's happened here? We put the slain lamb in this tomb, Jesus, the Lamb of God. And then all of a sudden he hears the voice of a roaring lion. And he's totally confused. He said, man, we put a slain lamb in there, and out comes a roaring lion. That's who's out of the grave, people. He was a slain lamb. But out of the tomb came a roaring lion, man. And he's roaring and raring for you to go. And he roars, he says, because I live, you can face tomorrow. Because I live, you can have peace with your past. Do like the thief on the cross and dump your baggage like the woman at the well. Dump it, people, and walk away free. He's crying out to you as the lion. He says, I am the roaring lion, and because I live, you have my power through my presence. Yes, I love hanging out with the roaring lion because the devil runs around like a wolf. The roaring lion is going to take him apart because of the power of who he is in his risen form. I hope you come to that moment. It can be terrible, terrible, terrible. But then there's the moment when you hear the voice of the lion. Okay, we're going to sing that song I told you about. Take note of the second verse. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. And we're going to sing the second verse, hey? Cool. Okay, sing it, and then I'll be back. Thanks, Lizzie.